Hello all, and continuing our discussions on Immanuel Kant, we're going to now look at the critique of pure reason in its early portion of the text to do with the Transcendental Aesthetic and the Method for the most part. And so how is he going to do this, of course, is in regards to the pure intuition, as he famously points to space and time. And so intuition is what arrives from the mind out of sensory data or our sensibilities. It's the form of appearances that he confirms as the senses rubbing up against matter in this sort of Newtonian. But of course, as the method looks to do, he wants to establish, what are the forms to make sensibility possible to begin with. That's the transcendental philosophy. And so obviously this comes with the notion of form as appearance within the human subject itself. And so that's how he wants to ultimately build towards the objectiveness of the human subject being able to experience things through the conditions of space and time that are represented through us in that sort of subjective capacity. That's how he's trying to end his epoch of Hume and Newtonian science that ultimately jumps towards freedom and belief, as you'll see. So obviously, things that appear to you are phenomenon that are conditioned by the human mind that lets us form these sort of objective statements, and how he makes room for science. It's a sort of self-sufficient object, the sort of, if you will, like a kind of X-ray perspective that takes the object and suspends it out into this sort of transcendental phase space. That's what Heidegger would critique Western thought on, this sort of privileging of space and time for the sort of scientific experience is something that Heidegger obviously was very wary of. And so really what he's trying to say for the aesthetic is that time and space in relation to the human subject is what makes sensory experience possible to begin with. But space alone isn't a concept. It's an intuition that it's the pure intuition and form that makes all other intuitions and mental representations that we can have possible to begin with. So the human mind is presupposing. The way he tries to argue this, of course, is that we couldn't have geometry, we couldn't have these sort of a priori categories if space wasn't presupposed to be something out there. Otherwise, we wouldn't have geometry, it wouldn't make sense to us. Obviously, he's speaking in his day and time, and there's been changes since then, but I think really, though, what you have to get at for Kant here is he's definitely pointing out a philosophy towards understanding that the human cognition definitely has its own modes of ways of which things will be represented to us, and we're ultimately just a part of this cognition scheme. We can't escape it, despite the fact that there's been so much scientific change since the 18th century, of course, but this still is valid even to this day, that you can't escape this sort of cognition that he's trying to point out here. And so when he talks about something such as the noumenal, what's really out there, we can't actually know. That's sort of the mystery of it all. That's how he throws in and makes room for belief in this Newtonian world, and ultimately freedom, of course, is that we can't actually know what's really out there since we're a part of human experience, and it's subjugated to those categories. So that's how he makes room for belief. And obviously, people who were inspired by Kant and the forces of the mind, as it were, and how it plays with spirit, that's going to come into German idealism, obviously. And of course, as it goes towards the 20th and 21st century, as it were, then it becomes more about being able to impose the self totally dependent on its own and its subjectiveness, taking it to the extreme end, as it were. Definitely not something that Kant, although he maybe did in some regards, I would say, actually kind of saw this coming, or saw the potential for it to be undermined, but nonetheless, what can you do? Although it is important to point out here, when you are talking about time and space, though, with Kant, it's important to point out that he is saying that you can't just have time and space as this sort of abstract concept of its own. It's, through the objects itself that makes it possible to begin with. That's the fall that he saw with thinkers prior to him. They were trying to establish that this is its own sort of existence or concept out there. It's actually in relation to the objects themselves that makes it possible through the human subject, is a rough around way of looking at it. And since time, of course, it makes itself known through our inner self, through thought, since it kind of, has that sort of linear capacity with memory and whatnot. This is a kind of presupposition that he points to. While he doesn't think that they're objectively out there, we ultimately are constructing them through the human subject, as it were. And so without the subject, obviously, the object then goes down the drain. Without it, you can't really have an object. You'll just have a sort of space of nothingness. You'll strip it completely of its qualities. But that's ultimately how he ends up with the idea that there's the pure intuition. When you strip an object down of its color and of its and every other quality that it's comprised of, you'll ultimately end up with its spatial structure, is how he's going to argue the intuitions. You're not going to be able to, of course, imagine an object without its spatial qualities. And of course, within the mind itself, we are able to think in those kind of spatial capacities. So really, Kant's trying to form an objectiveness of how the human mind itself is constructed. Obviously, this is going to get turned around and relativized over time, since he is embedding it into the human subject and what that means for cultural norms, cultural truths, as it were, in the later part of the century. Spengler obviously is going to say that this is the Western mind trying to affirm its objective, universal notion here. And it's very interesting to see how many different ways that Kant's philosophy is taken, despite how technical it's presented here in the Critique of Pure Reason. Nonetheless, there's so much philosophy that is explored through what the processes of the human mind and the human subject and its ambitions towards appearances as opposed to what's objectively out there, is how he really makes metaphysics and redeems it in the end. Is that through its subjectiveness, he points to the realness of his ethics, of God, of of what's to come with judgment and what he has to say about those sort of things. So yeah, this is just a video really covering the method and the aesthetic for the most part. The next one will be on the understanding, and I hope you guys are enjoying the series so far.